The autumn wind bit through the thin jacket of the 5-year-old boy as he stood near the school gate. Most of the other children had already run toward the waiting buses or their parents' cars, their laughter echoing in the crisp afternoon air. But Leo just stood there, shivering. Beside him stood his twin brother Liam, looking just as small and fragile against the backdrop of the sprawling brick school building. They were waiting, though they weren't quite sure what for anymore. Peter, a fourth-grade history teacher, was locking up his classroom for the day when he glanced out the window and spotted the two little figures. He sighed softly, grabbing his briefcase and heading down the hallway. This was becoming a pattern. He had noticed the twins weeks ago. They were quiet in the cafeteria, often picking at small portions of food, and their clothes always looked a size too big. Hanging off their small frames like sacks, Peter pushed open the heavy side door of the school and stepped out into the cool breeze. He walked over to the boys, his shoes crunching on the gravel. "Hey guys," Peter said gently, crouching down so he was eye level with them. "The buses left a long time ago. Is someone coming to pick you up?" Leo looked down at his sneakers, which were held together by a piece of tape on the side. Liam looked at Peter with large, sad eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of exhaustion. "Our mommy is sleeping," Liam whispered. "Is she sick?" Peter asked, keeping his voice low. "She just sleeps a lot," Leo replied, his voice defensive, like a tiny soldier protecting the fort. "We're not supposed to wake her." Peter felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen their mother once or twice. She was a young woman who looked perpetually tired, her face drawn and pale. He remembered seeing her at the grocery store a few weeks back, counting out pennies for a loaf of bread. The realization hit him hard. These kids weren't just waiting for a late ride. They were waiting because there was no one else to come. "Well, you can't stay out here in the cold," Peter said, standing up and offering his hands. "How about I drive you home? I have some granola bars in my car, and I bet you two are hungry." The twins hesitated. They had been taught about stranger danger, but Peter wasn't a stranger. He was the teacher who always smiled at them in the hallway. Liam nodded first, slipping his small, cold hand into Peter's warm palm. Leo followed a moment later. The drive to their apartment was short, but it felt like a journey into a different world. The neighborhood was rough, with boarded-up windows and graffiti on the walls. Peter pulled up to a crumbling building where the front door hung slightly off its hinges. The twins led him up 3 flights of dark stairs that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and dampness. When they opened the door to apartment 4B, the smell that hit Peter was overwhelming, a mix of unwashed clothes, rotting food, and sickness. Inside, the small apartment was dimly lit. The shades were drawn tight. In the corner of the living room, on a sagging couch, lay a woman. She didn't move when the door opened. Peter walked over quietly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He gently shook her shoulder. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She stirred slowly, blinking her eyes open. They were glassy and unfocused. When she saw Peter, a look of pure panic crossed her face. "Did I do it again?" she croaked, her voice raspy. "I'm sorry. I took the medicine the doctor gave me, and I couldn't wake up." Peter looked around the room. There was barely any food in the kitchen. The twins' beds were just piles of blankets on the floor. It was clear that this woman loved her boys. Peter could see the way she reached out a trembling hand to touch Liam's cheek, but she was drowning. She was physically and mentally unable to care for them, and the darkness was swallowing them all whole. "You're sick," Peter said softly, not judging, just stating a fact. "You need help." "I don't have money for a doctor," she whispered, tears leaking from her eyes. "I tried. I really tried." Peter looked at the twins. They were standing by the door, watching their mother with a mixture of love and terrifying resignation. They were used to this. They were used to being the adults, to being quiet, to going hungry. No 5-year-old should have a face that looks that serious. Peter made a decision right there. He couldn't fix the mother's illness, and he couldn't wave a magic wand to make the rent disappear. But he could make sure these 2 boys ate dinner tonight, and he knew that this situation couldn't go on. It wasn't safe. "I'm going to call someone who can help you get better," Peter told her gently. "And tonight, I'm going to take the boys to get some hot food. Is that okay?" The mother looked at her sons, then back at Peter. She knew she was losing the battle. She nodded slowly, covering her face with her hands as she began to sob that evening. Peter took Leo and Liam to a small diner on the edge of town. He watched in silence as they devoured plates of pancakes and scrambled eggs like they hadn't eaten in days. They ate politely, wiping their mouths with napkins, proving that their mother had taught them manners even in the midst of chaos. When the food was gone, they sat back in the booth, their eyes finally drooping with heavy fatigue. "Mr. Peter," Leo asked, his voice drowsy. "Yeah, buddy. Are we going to a new home?" Peter paused. He hadn't told them about the call he made to Child Protective Services on the way to the diner. He knew the social worker would come in the morning. He knew the twins would likely be taken into the system. It broke his heart to think of them in a sterile foster facility, separated from each other or shuffled around. "I don't know, Leo," Peter said honestly, "but I promise I'm not going to let you disappear. I'm going to check on you." Liam reached across the table and grabbed Peter's pinky finger with his tiny hand. "Promise?" Peter looked at the two identical faces, full of hope and fear. He squeezed Liam's finger back. "I promise," Peter said. He drove them back to the apartment building where a social worker was waiting to take them to an emergency shelter for the night. Watching them walk away, clutching their small backpacks, was one of the hardest things Peter had ever done. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time after the car drove away, the autumn wind blowing his hair. He went home to his empty house that night, but he couldn't sleep. All he could see were those two pairs of eyes looking at him over a plate of pancakes. The system was cold and impersonal. He knew that. He knew that without an advocate, those sweet boys would just become case numbers, shuffled from house to house until they aged out. Peter sat on the edge of his bed and looked at a photo of his own parents on his nightstand. He had always wanted a family of his own, but life hadn't worked out that way yet. Maybe, he thought, this was why. Maybe he hadn't found a family because he was meant to save one. The next morning, Peter didn't just go to teach history. He went to the county courthouse. He asked the clerk for the paperwork to become a foster parent. The clerk looked at him over her glasses. "This takes a long time, sir? Background checks, home visits. It's months of work." "I know," Peter said, his jaw set with determination. "I have time. But those boys don't." He walked out of the courthouse with a thick stack of forms under his arm. The battle had just begun, and he knew the road ahead would be filled with lawyers, judges, and people who would tell him he couldn't do it. But as he thought of Leo and Liam, he knew he wouldn't stop until they were safe. He made a silent vow to the empty street. He was going to fight for them until he had no fight left in him. They were going to be his sons, no matter what the world said. The days turned into weeks, and for Peter, the silence in his house was louder than ever before. He had thrown himself into the stack of paperwork required to become a foster parent, filling out forms until his hand cramped. He answered every personal question, opened up his financial history, and allowed strangers to walk through his home, peeking into closets and checking the temperature of the water heater. He did it all with a smile, because every time he looked at the blank space on his living room wall, he pictured Leo and Liam hanging their drawings there. However, the system was not as fast as his heart. The boys had been placed in an emergency shelter, a place with white walls and metal beds, where the staff was overworked and the food was bland. Peter visited them every single day after school. He would sit on the edge of Liam's bed and read them stories or play cards with Leo on the floor. Those 30 minutes were the highlight of their day, and they were the only thing keeping Peter going. But soon, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The social worker assigned to the case, a stern woman named Mrs. Higgins, did not think Peter was the right fit for the twins. One rainy afternoon, Peter sat in a small, stiff chair across from Mrs. Higgins in her cramped office. The air smelled of old coffee and wet wool. She shuffled through a stack of papers, frowning without looking up at him. "Mr. Peter," she finally said, adjusting her glasses, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, I really do. But we have to be realistic here. You are a single man, you live alone. You have a full-time job that keeps you busy until late in the afternoon. Peter leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. I know my schedule, Mrs. Higgins, but I have a great support system. My neighbor has promised to help if I'm ever running late. And I love those boys. I know them. I'm the only familiar face they have right now. Mrs. Higgins sighed and tapped a pen on the desk. Love isn't enough, unfortunately. These children have special needs. They have emotional trauma from neglect. They need a stable, two-parent household, or at least someone with experience fostering special needs children. We have a lovely couple on file, the Hendersons. They have a big house in the suburbs, and no children of their own. They are very interested. Peter felt a cold flash of panic. The Hendersons, he had heard of them. They were nice people, probably. But they didn't know Leo. They didn't know that Liam was scared of the dark and needed a nightlight, or that Leo loved dinosaurs and could tell you every fact about a T-Rex. They were strangers. They are my students, Peter argued, his voice rising slightly. I have taught them. I know their personalities. Taking them away from me and their school to live with strangers in the suburbs will only hurt them more. They need consistency. Consistency is following the protocol, Mrs. Higgins shot back. And the protocol suggests a different placement for now. We need to explore all options for the boys' long-term well-being. The meeting ended with Peter feeling defeated, but he wasn't ready to give up. He walked out of the office and drove straight to the library. He spent hours that night reading every law and regulation he could find about foster care and adoption in the state. He was determined to find a way to fight for them. A week later, a new obstacle appeared. The boys' grandmother on their mother's side stepped into the picture. She was a woman who lived in a different state, miles away. She hadn't been involved in the boys' lives for years. But now that there was talk of the state taking custody permanently, she suddenly wanted a say. She hired a lawyer. It was a messy situation. She claimed in court documents that she was family, and that blood was thicker than water. She argued that the boys should be sent to live with her. Peter knew she meant well, perhaps, but he also knew the truth. She was elderly, living in a small apartment. And she hadn't been able to help her own daughter when she was sick and struggling. How would she manage two energetic 5-year-olds? The court dates became a blur. Peter sat on the hard wooden benches. In the back of the courtroom, watching the lawyers argue, his lawyer, a friend from college who was helping him for free, did his best to argue that Peter was the psychological parent to the twins, that he was the one who had been there, when no one else was. But the grandmother's lawyer was aggressive. My client is their flesh and blood, he shouted one afternoon. This teacher is just a do-gooder who will likely move on in a year when the novelty wears off. The boys belong with their family. The word novelty made Peter's blood boil. He looked over at the twins, who were sitting quietly on a bench near the clerk's desk, swinging their legs back and forth. They didn't understand the big words being thrown around. They just knew they were scared. Every time the grandmother walked past them, they shrank back. They didn't know her. To them, she was just another stranger, trying to take them away from the life they knew. As the months dragged on, the pressure on Peter increased. The school principal called him in one day. Peter, he said gently, are a good teacher, but these legal troubles are distracting you. Parents are talking. We need you focused on the classroom. Peter felt like he was being attacked from all sides. The social department blocked him. The grandmother challenged him, and now his job was on the line. He spent his weekends painting. An extra bedroom in his house, getting it ready for the boys, even though the judge had forbidden him from taking them yet. He bought 2 twin beds with race car sheets. He set up a bookshelf filled with storybooks. He needed to believe it was going to happen. Then came the lowest point. It was a Tuesday evening when Peter went to visit the boys at the temporary group home. The matron at the desk stopped him. I'm sorry, she said, not looking him in the eye. Visitation has been suspended for the week due to the ongoing custody dispute. The grandmother's lawyer filed a motion. Can I at least say hi from the door? Peter pleaded. I brought them their favorite cookies. No, sir. It's the rules. Why, Peter walked back to his car, the box of cookies sitting heavy on the passenger seat. He sat there for a long time, staring out the windshield at the gray sky. He felt helpless. The bureaucracy was a giant machine, grinding forward without any regard for the hearts involved. It felt like the world was conspiring to keep him and the boys apart. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. "I don't care what it costs," Peter said, his voice shaking. "I don't care if I have to sell my car. We are fighting this. We are taking it to the judge. I am not letting those boys be sent to live with a stranger in another state. I am their father in every way that matters." It was going to be the biggest battle of his life. He was just a simple teacher, not a millionaire or a powerful lawyer. But as he looked at the empty passenger seat, he knew that sometimes the most ordinary people have to do extraordinary things for the ones they love. He wiped his eyes, started the engine, and drove home to prepare for the final hearing. He wasn't fighting a case anymore. He was fighting for his family. The morning of the final hearing arrived under a sky the color of old iron. Rain splattered against the pavement, turning the city streets into mirrors of gray and black. Peter stood outside the courthouse, his stomach doing somersaults. He adjusted his tie, which felt too tight around his neck, and took a deep breath. Today was the day everything would change. It felt like the most important test of his life, but there was no textbook to study for this one. Inside, the building was cold and smelled of floor wax and old paper. The footsteps of lawyers and hurried echoed loudly off the marble floors. Peter walked into the courtroom, which was smaller than he expected, but felt much larger because of the tension in the air. He sat in the wooden pew behind his lawyer's table, clutching his hat in his hands. He scanned the room anxiously. On the other side, the grandmother sat with her expensive lawyer. She looked tired, Peter thought. She wasn't an evil person, just someone trying to do what she thought was right, even if it was wrong for the boys. She refused to look at him. The social worker, Mrs. Higgins, was also there, sitting stiffly with a stack of files in front of her. She had made it clear in her reports that she still believed the boys should go to a couple in the suburbs, or the grandmother. Peter felt like he was surrounded by a wall of resistance. Then, a side door opened, and the twins walked in. They were holding hands so tightly, their knuckles were white. A court officer led them to a bench near the front. Leo looked pale, and Liam had his head down. When they spotted Peter, their faces lit up for a split second, a spark of recognition in a scary place. Peter gave them a small, reassuring wave, and they relaxed their shoulders just a little. He wanted to run over and scoop them up in a hug to tell them it was going to be okay. But he knew he couldn't. He had to stay in his seat, the judge. A tall man with silver hair and spectacles that sat low on his nose walked in and took his seat at the high bench. Everyone stood up and then sat down. The room went silent, save for the scratching of the lawyer's pen and the hum of the air conditioner. The lawyer for the grandmother stood up first. He spoke in a loud, confident voice. "Your Honor, we are here to ensure these children stay with their blood family. The grandmother is willing and able to take them. This teacher, Mr. Peter, is a single man with no parenting experience. He has a job that takes up all his day. These boys need stability, not a bachelor who thinks raising kids is a hobby." Peter felt the words like stings. A hobby? They weren't a hobby. They were his life. Then Mrs. Higgins stood up. She smoothed her skirt and looked at her notes. "Your Honor, the department agrees that while Mr. Peter has good intentions, the best interests of the children lie with a more traditional family unit or a family member. The boys have complex emotional needs. We believe the grandmother is the appropriate placement." It felt like the air was being sucked out of the room. Peter looked at his lawyer, who stood up and buttoned his jacket. "Your Honor," Peter's lawyer began, "we respectfully disagree. Blood relation is not the only thing that makes a parent. Mr. Peter has been there for these boys for over a year. He knows their medical history, their allergies, their fears, and their dreams. To tear them away from the only father figure they have ever known would cause irreparable harm. Stability isn't about a wife or a big house. It's about love and consistency, which Mr. Peter has provided in abundance." The arguments went back and forth. Legal terms were thrown around: guardianship, custody, suitability, home studies. It was a dance of words, but the real people, the two little boys on the bench, were getting lost in it all. Peter felt helpless. It all came down to the decision of one man behind a desk. Suddenly a loud noise broke the tension. The heavy wooden door to the courtroom swung open, hitting the wall with a bang. Everyone stopped talking and turned to look. It was the bailiff coming back in, but he wasn't the problem. The problem was that while the adults were distracted, the stress had finally become too much for Leo. He couldn't sit there one more second listening to people decide his fate like he was a piece of furniture. Leo stood up and pulled Liam with him. They weren't crying, but their faces were set with a fierce determination. They ignored the bailiff telling them to sit down. They ignored their grandmother, who reached out a hand to stop them. They walked straight past the lawyers, past Mrs. Higgins, and right up to the railing that separated the audience from the judge's bench. They were so small compared to the tall wood railing. The court officer stepped forward to block them, thinking they were lost or confused. "Your Honor?" "I'll remove them," the officer said, starting to herd them back. "No," Peter said, standing up instinctively, his heart in his throat. "Let them speak." The judge held up a hand, signaling the officer to stop. He looked down over his glasses at the two 5-year-olds standing before him. The courtroom was so silent you could hear a pin drop. "Boys," the judge said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "you can't be up here. You need to go sit back down." Leo shook his head bravely. He gripped the wooden rail with both hands. "No, sir. We have to say something." Liam squeezed his brother's hand. He looked terrified, but he stood his ground next to Leo. "You can talk," the judge said, leaning forward slightly. "But you must be quick." Leo took a deep breath, his little chest rising and falling. He looked up at the most powerful person in the room, but he spoke like he was talking to a friend. "We don't want to go to Grandma's house," Leo said, his voice clear and loud in the quiet room. "We don't know her. We don't know the people in the suburbs. We know Mr. Peter." The judge listened. "But the court has to decide who is best to take care of you." "He takes care of us," Liam chimed in, his voice wobbling a little. "He makes us pancakes. He checks under the bed for monsters. He reads us stories when we are scared." "He is our daddy," Leo said, the words hanging in the air. "He might not be the one who made us, but he's the one who loves us. Please, don't take us away from him. We want to go home with him." A tear rolled down Liam's cheek, and he quickly wiped it away with his sleeve. "We promise we will be good. Just let us stay with him." The grandmother stood up. "Now see here, they are confused. Sit down," the judge said sharply, not taking his eyes off the boys. Peter felt tears burning his own eyes. He had to bite his lip to keep from making a sound. It was the most brave and beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. These two small boys, who had been through so much, were standing up to the whole legal system to defend him. They were fighting for him just as hard as he had fought for them. The judge leaned back in his chair. He looked at the sobbing grandmother, then at the stern social worker, and finally at Peter, who was standing with his hand over his mouth, trying to hold it together. The silence stretched out, long and heavy. The rain tapped against the window pane, keeping time with the beating of everyone's hearts. The air in the room had shifted. It wasn't about legal arguments anymore. It wasn't about salaries or biology. It was about the truth standing right in front of the bench, wearing tiny sneakers and a brave face. The judge picked up his glasses and wiped them slowly, thinking, "Children," the judge said finally, "you have made your point very clear. You may sit down now." The boys looked at Peter one last time, and he nodded at them, giving them a thumbs up. They walked back to their seats, the tension in their small shoulders gone. They had said their piece. Now, it was up to the grown-ups to do the right thing. The silence in the room was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The judge looked down at the two little boys who had just poured their hearts out. Then he shifted his gaze to the lawyers, the social worker, and the grandmother. The expression on his face was serious, but his eyes had lost the cold, distant look they held when the trial began. He had seen something real in those 30 seconds, something that no stack of paperwork could describe. "Counsel," the judge said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "I have heard arguments about income, about biology, and about traditional family structures. But I believe we have lost sight of the most important factor in this case, the welfare of the children." He picked up a document from his desk. It was the report from Mrs. Higgins. Social worker here recommends placing the boys with their grandmother or a foster facility because she believes a single male teacher cannot provide the emotional stability these traumatized children need. Mrs. Higgins nodded stiffly. Believing her moment of victory had arrived, the judge continued. However, I have just witnessed two 5-year-old boys who are reportedly terrified and withdrawn stand up in a strange room full of adults and speak their truth. They didn't ask for toys. They didn't ask for a trip to Disney World. They asked for the man who loves them. He turned his eyes directly to Peter. Mr. Peter, stand up. Peter's legs felt shaky, but he stood. He felt every pair of eyes in the room locked onto him. You are a single man, the judge said. You have a modest income. You have no wife to help you. By the strict letter of the law, you are not the ideal candidate on paper. But the law is meant to serve people, not the other way around. I have seen fear in many children in my courtroom, but I have rarely seen the kind of trust Leo and Liam have in you. They do not look at you as a babysitter. They look at you as their protector. The judge paused, looking over at the grandmother. Madam, I know you love your grandsons, and I know you want to do what is right, but love alone is not enough to raise two high-energy children. You are not physically able to chase them, to play with them, or to give them the active life they need. Sending them to you would be placing a burden on you that is too heavy and placing the boys in an environment where they cannot thrive. She slumped back in her chair, the fight draining out of her. She knew he was right. She looked at the twins one last time and gave a small, sad nod. Then the judge looked at Mrs. Higgins. And as for the recommendation of the department, I am overriding it. I am granting full physical and legal custody of Leo and Liam to Mr. Peter, effective immediately. A gasp went through the room. Mrs. Higgins dropped her pen. Peter felt the world spin for a second. He gripped the back of the chair in front of him to keep from falling over. But the judge added, his voice dropping an octave, "This is not a permanent victory yet. I am granting custody with the requirement that you begin the adoption process immediately. I want monthly reports from the boys' pediatrician and from their school. I want to know that they are eating well, sleeping well, and happy. If you falter, Mr. Peter, if you cannot handle this, I will not hesitate to reverse my decision. Do you understand me?" "I understand, Your Honor," Peter said, his voice cracking. "I won't let you down. I won't let them down." "Then bring the paperwork to my clerk," the judge said, closing the folder with a final thud. Case dismissed. It took a moment for the words to sink in. The grandmother's lawyer packed up his briefcase without another word. The bailiff stepped aside. Peter didn't wait. He didn't care about the formalities. He walked straight to the bench where the twins were sitting. He dropped to his knees and opened his arms. They didn't run this time. They walked into his embrace and buried their faces in his shirt. Leo was crying quietly, and Liam was clinging to his neck like a monkey. Peter held them tight, closing his eyes and breathing them in. He could feel their small hearts beating against his chest. It was over. The fight was over. They were his. "We're going home, boys," Peter whispered. "We're going home." The ride home was different from any other car ride they had ever taken. Usually the car was quiet, filled with the sadness of saying goodbye at the shelter door. Today it was filled with noise. Liam wouldn't stop talking about how he wanted to put his dinosaur posters on the wall of his new room. Leo kept asking if they could stop for ice cream. Peter laughed, a real deep laugh that he hadn't let out in months. "Yes, ice cream. We can get as much ice cream as you want." They stopped at a small shop on the way. Peter bought them the biggest sundaes they had. They sat in the car by the curb, chocolate sauce smeared on their faces, grinning from ear to ear. It was a simple moment, but it felt like a celebration of a lifetime. When they finally pulled into Peter's driveway, the sun was beginning to set. It cast a golden glow over the house. It was just a simple house, a bit small maybe, with a front porch that needed painting. But to the twins, it looked like a castle. They ran up the walkway, bouncing with energy. Peter unlocked the front door and let them run inside first. "Is this really ours?" Leo asked, standing in the middle of the living room, spinning around slowly. "Yes," Peter said, tossing his keys onto the table. "This is really ours." "In that room there?" He pointed to the door on the left. "That is your bedroom." They squealed and ran down the hall. Peter heard them jumping on the beds, the race car beds he had bought months ago, and kept covered in plastic sheeting, hoping this day would come. He walked slowly down the hall and leaned against the doorframe watching them. They were throwing the pillows around, claiming their sides of the room, already arguing about who got the top bunk. It was chaos. It was loud. It was messy. And it was beautiful. Later that night, after the boys had worn themselves out and were tucked into their race car beds, Peter sat in the rocking chair in the corner. The room was dark, except for the small nightlight shaped like a star plugged into the wall. He thought about the day's events. He thought about the judge, who had looked past the rules to see the truth. He thought about the hard road ahead: adoption meetings, school meetings, helping them heal from the neglect they had suffered. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be bad days. There would be temper tantrums and nightmares. But then he looked at Liam, who was fast asleep with his thumb in his mouth, and Leo, who was hugging a stuffed bear Peter had bought him. Peter pulled out his phone and snapped. Quick picture of them sleeping. He sent it to his lawyer with a simple text. "Thank you." He put the phone away and closed his eyes, listening to the sound of their breathing. He wasn't just a teacher anymore. He wasn't just a foster parent. He was a dad. The title finally fit, and the journey to make it permanent was just beginning. He fell asleep in the chair, watching over them, finally at peace. The months that followed that day in court were not like a fairy tale where everything becomes perfect instantly. Real life is messier than that, and Peter knew it. There were hard mornings when the twins refused to get out of bed, days when they struggled in school, and nights when nightmares about their past sent them running into Peter's room, shaking with fear. But there was also a profound sense of peace that settled over the house. The chaos was good chaos. It was the noise of a living, breathing family. 6 months after the judge's ruling, the house hardly looked the same. The walls were covered in colorful drawings of dinosaurs and spaceships. Small shoes cluttered the entryway, and the backyard was trampled flat from hours of tag and football. Peter had learned to cook in bulk, his freezer always stocked with frozen pancakes and chicken nuggets. He was tired, often running on coffee and pure willpower. But he had never felt more alive. Then came the warm afternoon in late spring when the final step was about to happen. The adoption papers had been approved, the background checks were cleared, and the social worker, Mrs. Higgins, had actually signed off on the forms with a smile. Admitting that Peter had done a wonderful job, they returned to the same courthouse where the battle had taken place. This time the sky was a bright, endless blue, and the sun was shining. Peter held one of the boys' hands in each of his. They were dressed in matching little suits that Peter had saved up for, looking sharp and grown. Dash up. The mood in the courtroom was completely different. There were no lawyers arguing today, no stern faces or heavy tension. The judge sat on the bench, wearing his robes, but he was smiling. The grandmother was there too. She had come to terms with the situation and had visited the boys a few times since the trial. She sat in the back, wiping tears from her eyes with a handkerchief. Happy to see them looking so healthy and loved, Peter stood before the bench with Leo and Liam. The judge opened a large book and picked up his pen.
We
are here today to finalize the adoption of Leo and Liam, the judge announced, his voice echoing kindly through the room. This is the final step in a journey that started in difficulty, but has led to a place of great love. He looked down at the twins. Boys, do you understand that today, Mr. Peter, becomes your father forever? Not just for a little while, but for your whole lives. Leo nodded his head vigorously. Yes, sir. And do you promise to love him, listen to him, and be part of his family? We promise, Liam said. The judge turned to Peter. And do you, Peter, take these boys to be your sons? Do you promise to care for them, guide them, and love them unconditionally no matter what happens? Peter looked down at the two faces looking up at him. He saw the trust in their eyes, a trust that had been broken once but was now healing. He felt a lump in his throat so big he could barely speak. He took a deep breath and said, clearly and firmly, I do. The judge signed the paper with a flourish. He picked up his gavel and tapped it on the wood. though not very hard. I hereby pronounce that these boys are legally and forever your sons. Congratulations, Dad. The word Dad hung in the air like music. Peter knelt down and hugged them tight. They wrapped their arms around his neck, squeezing him with all their might. The room erupted in quiet applause. Even Mrs. Higgins was clapping. The grandmother came up and kissed the boys on the forehead, shaking Peter's hand. "You did good," she whispered to him. "They are where they belong." Outside the courthouse, the sun felt warmer than usual. A photographer friend was waiting on the steps. "Okay, everyone, look at the camera," she shouted. They tried to take a serious photo first. Peter stood in the middle with his hands on the boys' shoulders. They all smiled nicely. But then the photographer said, "Okay, now give me a fun one." Without hesitating, Peter scooped both boys up into his arms, one under each arm. They shrieked with laughter, kicking their legs. Peter laughed so hard he had to squint his eyes shut. The photographer clicked the button just at that perfect moment. It was a picture of pure, unfiltered joy. No fancy poses, no stiff suits, just a father and his sons, happy to be together. That photo found a place of honor on the mantelpiece in the living room, right next to the drawing of the three stick figures holding hands that the twins had made for him. Months ago, life moved forward. Birthdays were celebrated with big cakes and too many candles. Christmas mornings were chaotic with wrapping paper everywhere. There were scraped knees to bandage, homework to struggle over, and parent-teacher conferences where Peter beamed with pride at how well they were doing years later. When the twins were tall and strong, heading off to high school, they would still look at that photo on the mantelpiece and remember that day. They would remember the man who fought a system, who ignored the people who said he couldn't do it, and who chose them when they had no one. Peter often sat in his rocking chair in the quiet evenings, looking at that photo. He thought about the scared, lonely teacher he used to be and the full, noisy, wonderful life he had now. He realized that the judge was right that day in court. Biology didn't make a family, love did. And every time he heard the front door open and two familiar voices call out, "Dad, we're home," he knew he had won the greatest prize in the world. The twin boys who begged a judge for a father had finally found their home, right in the heart of the man who refused to let them go.